Before my fingers even made contact with the metal, the massive doors moved on their own. Without a single gust of wind, and without any human intervention, the two heavy wooden doors smoothly and forcefully swung completely shut in my face. When we think of haunted locations, our minds usually drift to the obvious places. Abandoned psychiatric hospitals with peeling paint, decaying prisons with a dark history of violence, or old Victorian houses sitting alone at the end of a dead-end street. We expect the dead to linger in places of trauma. But there is a different kind of haunting. It's quieter, more insidious, and in many ways, infinitely more depressing. What happens when a human soul isn't trapped by murder or revenge, but by a misplaced sense of duty? What happens when you die, but you just can't bring yourself to clock out of your shift? In downtown St. Petersburg, Florida, sitting quietly on the edge of the water, is the Unitarian Universalist Church of Mirror Lake. It is a stunning, rough stucco building erected in 1929. It is designed to be a place of absolute peace, spiritual warmth, and welcoming inclusion. But because its doors are open to everyone, it seems to have attracted visitors who no longer belong to the world of the living. These are not stories of demonic possession or violent poltergeists. These are 3 first-hand accounts from the clergy, the volunteers, and the night staff of the Mirror Lake Church. They prove that sometimes the most terrifying thing a ghost can do is absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. Here are 3 true stories of the unseen laborers of St. Petersburg. The account of the lead pastor. I have always believed that a church should be a place of comfort. I serve as the lead pastor at Mirror Lake, and my theological background has always been rooted in keeping an open mind and an open door. Our building is nearly a century old. It has seen thousands of weddings, funerals, tearful confessions, and joyous celebrations. When you have a structure made of heavy stone, thick wood, and imported Spanish roof tiles that literally absorb the sweat of the workmen who built it, that building is going to hold on to some energy. I'm used to the creaks and groans of the old architecture. But what happened to me didn't happen in the spooky dead hours of the night. It happened in the harsh, unforgiving light of a Tuesday morning. It was around 11 a.m. The Florida sun was beating down outside, streaming through the tall windows and casting these brilliant, sharp pools of light across the sanctuary floor. The church was completely closed to the public that day. The administrative staff were either off or tucked away in the modern 1960s educational wing next door. I was entirely alone in the main 1929 sanctuary. I was doing something completely mundane, walking up and down the aisles, checking the wooden pews for a pair of reading glasses that an elderly congregant had left behind after Sunday service. The acoustic design of an old mission revival church is something you have to experience to understand. The vaulted ceilings are engineered to take the unamplified human voice and project it clearly to the back row. Because of this, when the church is empty, the silence is incredibly heavy. It's almost pressurized. I was about halfway down the center aisle when that heavy silence was broken. I stopped walking. The sound was coming from the far left side of the nave, near the side alcoves. It wasn't the sound of a building settling. It wasn't the wind. It was the distinct, unmistakable sound of complex human movement. It sounded exactly like the heavy, shuffling friction of someone shifting their body weight against the aging wooden pews. It was the cadence of someone doing manual labor. It sounded exactly like a dedicated church volunteer who had quietly let themselves in with a spare key and was diligently polishing the wood and sweeping between the rows. I didn't feel a drop of fear. I am a rational guy, and the sun was shining brightly. I just figured someone from the maintenance committee had come in off schedule to do some deep cleaning. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Is someone over there?" I'm just looking for some lost glasses." I waited for the entirely normal, polite response. I got absolutely nothing. The silence slammed back down into the room. The rustling had stopped the exact second I spoke. Suddenly feeling a strange, cold knot form in my stomach, I walked over to the left side of the sanctuary. I checked the first alcove. Empty. I walked down the side aisle, peering between every single row of pews. There was no one there. No cleaning supplies, no rags, no person. I was completely, undeniably alone in a massive, locked room. That is when the true horror of the situation hit me. If this had happened at midnight, in the pitch black, my brain could have rationalized it. I could have blamed shadows, fatigue, or an overactive imagination. But in the brilliant mid-morning light, your senses don't lie to you. The visual field was crystal clear. The rustling I heard was a deliberate, localized, kinetic interaction with the physical environment. Something unseen had been mimicking the exact cadence of a human being performing menial labor. It wasn't a ghost trying to scare me. It was an entity trapped in an echo of maintenance. It was scrubbing wood that was already clean in an empty room over and over again. It stripped away all the Hollywood glamour of the paranormal and left me with a deeply depressing reality. Someone was spending their afterlife doing unpaid chores. I quickly abandoned the search for the glasses, locked the sanctuary doors behind me, and spent the rest of the day in my brightly lit, modern office, trying very hard not to think about who or what was keeping the pew so clean. The account of the veteran volunteer. I don't scare easily. Before I became a dedicated volunteer at the Mirror Lake congregation back in 2006, I actually spent 14 years working as a professional ghost tour guide in the area. I know the local lore, I know how old buildings sound, and I know the difference between a drafty window and something genuinely unnatural. But knowing about the paranormal doesn't make you immune to it when it decides to target you directly. My encounter happened about 10 years ago, on a quiet weekday afternoon. We had just finished hosting a midday community meeting in the main building. By 2 p.m., the congregation had completely cleared out. The parking lot was empty, the chatter was gone, and the building had settled back into its usual, imposing quiet. I was the co-leader of the event, so I drew the short straw. My job was to stay behind, sit at a small folding table near the back of the church, and collate a massive stack of paper surveys that the attendees had filled out. It was tedious, mind-numbing paperwork. I was sitting there alone, focused entirely on shuffling papers, enjoying the peace and quiet. The atmosphere in the room was suddenly shattered by a massive, violent noise. It was the sound of the church's main entrance doors swinging wide open. You need to understand the architecture here to grasp why this is so impossible. The entrances to the 1929 sanctuary are not lightweight, hollow-core office doors. They are massive, heavy-duty, cast stone and thick wood structures reinforced with heavy iron latching mechanisms. It takes actual physical muscle to push the latch down, overcome the dead weight of the doors, and swing them open. A gust of wind cannot move them. A shift in air pressure cannot move them. Naturally, I assumed someone from the meeting had forgotten their purse or their keys and had come back inside. I put my pen down, pushed my chair back, and walked the 30 feet down the hall to the main entrance to greet them. I stepped into the entryway. The heavy doors were completely shut. The iron latches were perfectly secure in their housings. I pushed the door open myself, feeling the heavy, familiar resistance of the wood, and looked out onto the street. Mirror Lake Drive was empty. The sidewalks were clear. There was nobody walking away, no cars pulling out of the lot. I frowned, feeling a tiny prickle of unease on the back of my neck. Okay, I thought. Maybe it was a weird acoustic echo from a garbage truck hitting a dumpster down the alley. You always try to find the logical explanation first. I secured the door, walked back to my folding table, sat down, and picked up my pen. Less than 3 minutes later, the exact same deafening, metallic grind of the heavy doors swinging open. My heart did a painful stutter step in my chest. I immediately stood up and power walked back to the entryway. Nothing. The doors were shut tight. The latch was secured. Total, mocking emptiness. I went back to my table, but I didn't pick up my pen. I just sat there, my eyes locked on the hallway leading to the entrance, my entire body rigid with adrenaline. Over the next 45 minutes, that exact sequence happened 3 more times. By the 5th time, I didn't even get up to check. The psychological attrition of the repetition was breaking me down. It is one thing to have a quick jump scare in a dark room. It is a completely different, infinitely worse kind of horror to sit in a brightly lit room and be forced to anticipate the impossible. I was trapped in a room with an invisible force that possessed massive physical strength, and it was locked in an incomprehensible, looping pantomime of entering the building. It was knocking on a door that it couldn't actually open. Or maybe it was opening a door that only existed in its own timeline. I finally shoved the uncollated surveys into my canvas tote bag, grabbed my keys, and practically ran out the side exit. I didn't care if the paperwork was late. I wasn't going to sit there and listen to the dead try to clock in for another shift. If you're enjoying this deep dive into true, unexplainable encounters, please take a second to hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed to Creepy Digest. It is the absolute best way to support the channel. Now, let's get into our final story, where a night watchman realizes that this church isn't just haunted. The account of the caretaker. Working the night shift in a nearly 100-year-old church requires a certain kind of compartmentalization. If you let your imagination run wild, the shadows stretching across the vaulted mission-style ceilings will drive you insane. I was a trusted member of the congregation, so I occasionally took on the responsibility of doing the final nocturnal security sweep of the property. Locking down a building that size is a process. You have to walk through the modern educational wing, the dark hallways, the offices, and finally, the massive 1929 sanctuary. It was late, approaching 11:30 p.m. I had just finished turning off the breakers for the interior lights, leaving only the dim, amber glow of the emergency exit signs casting long, weird shapes across the wooden pews. I have to admit, there are parts of the church I absolutely hate being near at night. Specifically, the second-floor balcony where the massive church organ sits. Whenever I walked beneath it, I always got this intense, suffocating feeling that an older, deeply authoritative woman was glaring daggers into the back of my head, completely furious that I was in her territory. But I had a job to do. I kept my head down and walked toward the heavy front doors to do the final lockup. As I crossed the dark nave, I happened to glance out one of the narrow, decorative side windows that looked out onto the exterior grounds. There was a man standing in the dark, just beyond the edge of the manicured lawn. I froze. He was a tall, pitch-black silhouette, completely devoid of any distinguishing features. But he wasn't just standing there. He was pacing back and forth furiously, right along the invisible property line of the church. It looked like he was desperately trying to get inside the building, but was physically slamming into an invisible brick wall. Every time he stepped toward the church, his form would shudder, and he would be violently repelled backward into the shadows. A wave of primal, evolutionary panic washed over me. The church wasn't just old and creepy. The building itself was acting as a fortified shield, actively defending the perimeter against whatever malevolent thing was pacing outside in the dark. I realized I needed to get the heavy front doors deadbolted immediately. I sprinted the last 20 feet toward the main entrance. I was about 5 feet away from the heavy wooden sanctuary doors, my hands reaching out to grab the iron handles to pull them shut. Before my fingers even made contact with the metal, the massive doors moved on their own. Without a single gust of wind, and without any human intervention, the two heavy wooden doors smoothly and forcefully swung completely shut in my face. The heavy iron deadbolt audibly threw itself into the locked position. I stood there, my hands hovering in the empty air, staring at the locked door. I couldn't breathe. The sheer kinetic force required to move those doors was immense. But then, the strangest thing happened. The primal terror of the shadowy figure outside completely vanished. The air in the entryway suddenly felt incredibly warm, thick, and overwhelmingly comforting. It felt like a heavy, protective blanket being dropped over my shoulders. I didn't run. I just stood there in the dark. For decades, there has been an oral legend passed around the older members of our congregation about a former groundskeeper and sexton named Richard. He worked here for 30 years, maintaining every inch of this property with an obsessive, fierce devotion, until cancer took him right before he could retire. I realized in that moment that I wasn't being attacked. I was being helped. The entity knew the nightly routine. It knew I was walking up to secure the building against the dark thing outside, and it simply executed the physical labor to lock the doors before I could do it myself. "Thank you, Richard," I whispered into the empty, dark entryway. The air seemed to hum with a palpable sensation of gratitude right before the warmth faded away, leaving me alone in the cold foyer. Years later, in 2025, a professional paranormal team came into the church at night with a spirit box, a device that sweeps radio frequencies to let entities speak. They stood in the dark sanctuary and asked the unseen presence for its name. Through the static, a clear, exhausted male voice answered with one word: "Richard." It's a beautiful thought, in a way, that someone loved this church so much they stayed behind to protect it. But as I walked to my car that night, looking back at the dark, imposing silhouette of the 1929 architecture, I just felt a crushing sense of profound sadness. Richard didn't get his retirement in life, and it seems the universe has denied him his rest in death. He is still working the graveyard shift, forever locking the doors to a world he left behind a long time ago. The most terrifying hauntings aren't always the ones that try to hurt you. Sometimes, the true horror is simply the realization that the endless, grinding routine of daily life might not actually end when your heart stops beating. If you ever find yourself alone in an old building and you hear the sound of sweeping when there is no broom or a heavy door closing itself to help you out, maybe just say thank you and get out before they ask you to take over the shift. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Creepy Digest so you never miss a new episode. Double check your locks tonight. And as always, thanks for watching.